She read the contract twice before she signed, because if she was going to sell a version of herself, she needed to know exactly what she was selling. The first page was glossy, the type crisp and implacable. The second page listed obligations, public appearances, interviews, a statement of companionship in formal language that smelled faintly of lawyers and reputation management. The final page, lower down, had a line Samuel Sharp insisted remain in the printed copy. The relationship is professional, temporary, and bound by the terms herein. He'd underlined it when he slid the pen across the table. His hand did not shake. Rosine Moore thought about the hospital bill that sat on the passenger seat of her beat-up sedan, about the pills in her brother's medicine cabinet, about how many nights of hunger her grandmother would go through if she did not take this. She thought about the phone call that had come 2 days earlier, her mother's voice small and urgent, the word eviction said like a verdict, and the amount Samuel's signature would make available in an account that would erase debt, buy treatments, and buy time. She signed. "You understand the terms?" Samuel said, watching her write with an expression that had already become famous in boardrooms and tabloids alike, precisely unreadable. He smiled almost as if this were the first time he could allow himself to be amused by someone else's desperation. Public appearances, discretion, 3 months, compensation issued in full 2 days after signing. 3 months, Rosine repeated, the surgeon's clarity in her voice. Not a lifetime. Neither a charity, he replied. The pen clicked. They both knew the difference. He slid the top copy back to her as though it were an ordinary anonymous transaction, as if there were no cameras outside the building, no columnist tracking every step of his life, no family at his table already making calculations about alliances and heirs, as if the only thing at stake were the straight line between a signature and a bank transfer. The truth was less tidy. Rosine had practiced her nonchalance in the mirror for weeks, rehearsed jokes, an easier laugh, the kind of soft, precise tilt of the head that made powerful men forget their own armor. She had not practiced how it would feel when a man like Samuel looked at her not as a temporary accessory, but as someone he did not want anyone else to see. "One more thing," she said before she left, because business always needed a final clause, a corner to fold back on. "If I do this, I keep control of the money. All of it goes into an account I manage. You don't make decisions about my family." His eyes narrowed for the briefest second, as if he had been trying to write the terms of her life into his ledger. Then he surprised her by nodding. "Agreed," he said. "Account in your name." She left with the contract and the scent of his cologne clinging to the crease of the paper. Outside, the city was in evening motion. Taxis honking, neon pooling on wet pavement, a cab's taillight bleeding red down the block. She wrapped the contract in her coat and felt the weight of it like an anchor and also, oddly, like a lifeline. If scandalous romance with a soft center is your guilty pleasure, like and subscribe for more. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Zelman, Zed, the brother who had once been the one with the loud laugh and the half-finished guitar leaning against the wall, was shrunken into himself under a tangle of sheets, his jaw slack with the exhaustion of pain he refused to name. Machines made patient, indifferent noises. Rosine sat by the small window rim, the contract folded in her lap, and watched sunlight make a pale square on the floor. She felt smaller and larger at once, small as the patient who needed medicine they could not afford, large as a woman who had just made a deal with a man who could change the size of their world. "Have you eaten?" her mother asked from the corner, her voice a thin filament of worry. Her father clutched a well-worn devotional book and kept turning its pages without reading them. "I signed something," Rosine said. "It will cover the operation, the therapy, everything he needs for now." Her mother's hand closed around hers so hard that Rosine imagined it would leave an indentation. She had always been the one to keep the family afloat, bills, broken promises, recipes for stretched dinners. It had been exhausting to be the backbone. It had also felt like a duty she had an obligation to keep. People like to imagine desperation as a neat, solitary thing, a single night of bad luck. In reality, desperation was a slow, nightly erosion. Money would not fix everything. It would, however, buy time. The early days of the contract were theater. Rosine learned how to tilt her chin just enough at press events so photographers would think she was amused rather than calculating. She practiced the cadence of laughter that said, without saying, "I belong here." Samuel was a master of controlled charm. He knew how to slide protection around someone like her, an interminable guard at the edge of the conversation that kept her from straying into dangerous questions. At the gala, an effort to tie Samuel's company to philanthropic initiatives, Rosine was luminous. That was the first time she saw the other side of the arrangement, the way chairs cleared when Samuel entered, how people leaned in until the room felt like a set designed to make him shine. She was the walking counterpoint, a piece of carefully placed color. She came to the stage under the flashing light as his companion, the cameras looking for the chemistry that would make this partnership convincing to shareholders and unsteady relatives alike. Querita Baird arrived in a gown like a challenge. Querita, engaged to one of the family's expected allies, had the kind of smile that was sharp at the edges, and she tried, with small gestures and lacquered jokes, to unship the calm of Rosine's public performance. Molly-haired reporters leaned forward, whispering predictions about alliances and who was being bought for what price. Rosine swallowed the bile of humiliation like something she was learning to digest. She had not come into this for glamour. She had come in because Zelman needed medicine, and because her father's handwriting on a past due notice could still be seen through the window of their house like a thin blade. If she had to become a painted accessory for 3 months to keep her brother's heart going, so be it. Her phone buzzed that night with messages from her mother. "Are you sure? Do you know what you're doing?" And from her brother, the one who could still text a joke even from one bed. "Don't let them turn you into someone you hate." Rosine set her phone face down and started to laugh, a dry little noise. She answered none of them. Samuel watched her the way a man studies a chessboard, not to make her a piece, but to see what she is capable of. He admired efficiency. He admired calculation. In private, his meetings with counsel and shareholders had made him an expert in people who were good at pretending. He calculated advantage and risk the way other men counted change. He told himself he was making a rational decision by offering a contract to Rosine. Image, loyalty, a clean arrangement that would keep the family from dragging more ephemeral things into the light. He had not expected, the first time he saw Rosine at his kitchen island after a long day of boardroom warfare, to feel the quiet pull towards something that was not a line item. He had not expected to want to protect the peculiar bright set of nerves that tightened under her witty, brittle surface. He catalogued it against his better judgment and told himself it was nonsense. People confuse affection and admiration. They tell themselves their feelings are a kind of strategy. Samuel told himself many things. Morris Keene was the kind of man who assumes people are commodities until someone proves otherwise. He circulated like a shadow at the gala, smiling the thin smile of someone who knows too much. Within a week, he was the first antagonist to test whether Rosine's new role made her exploitable. He slid an envelope across a table as if passing a menu, an informal exchange at a private after-party, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "We all know why you're here, Ms. Moore," Morris said quietly, leaning in the way men do when they think intimacy equals power. 3 months is nothing. People talk. A half-second clip in the right place and, well, reputations can be very flexible. "I think reputations should be earned, not auctioned," she said. She had learned to be sharp when it mattered. Morris's laugh was low. "You think in ideals. You'll find people are more pragmatic." He left the envelope behind like a careless lover. Rosine stood rooted until she felt the paper under her palm. An old phone with contact information and nothing else, except the unasked question of what he could do with a strategically placed clip. Morris had instincts for fright. His business was fear. Rosine knew that if she let him, she could be blackmailed into turn after small concession. She also knew where the power lurked, in acknowledging the fear but refusing to be moved by it. She took a picture of the phone, and then, with a small, decisive movement, she sent a message to an email address she had learned in her life of odd jobs, the sort of person who made things disappear. "If he tries anything, leak his long-lost accounts," she typed, "and mention that the source is Morris." She sent the message with the same steady hand that had signed the contract. It was the first small victory, not a moral triumph, but a practical one. She would not be prey. Samuel noticed the way she handled herself. He hardly ever felt threatened by women who said no. What unsettled him was her refusal to allow fear to make her smaller. He liked her as someone who refused to be diminished. There was an honesty in that he had not expected. For all his public stoicism, the family of Sharps was a cage of their own making. Sir Xavier Sharp, the patriarch, orchestrated a private life that was always watched. His idea of love came bundled with ledger entries and generational planning. He glanced at Rosine the first time she appeared at a family event as Samuel's companion and narrowed his gaze. The man saw lineages where others saw people. The arrival of someone like Rosine, someone with suspicion written all over her, who could be deployed as a social instrument, was both useful and dangerous. Useful for Samuel's image, dangerous for succession. Control the narrative, Sir Xavier told Samuel during a brief meeting. If the board is to consider any alternative to tradition, we need to present it as stability. Keep her in the light, keep her out of the shadows. This is not about her, it is about the company. The words were precise, the way one picks a scalpel for surgery. Samuel heard them and agreed outwardly. Privately, he bristled at how everyone was already presuming to own a piece of his choices. Rosine's family, by contrast, was unambiguous in their demands. Her mother insisted on meals and recounting old debts as if reciting history. Her father fretted at odd hours and then made grand promises he could not keep. Rosine found herself splitting time between two lives, one in which she negotiated a public persona with a man who measured every breath, and one that reopened the small cracks at home where need leaked through like water. The first scandal came via an innocuous handler's reel. A party photographer, hungry and talented and anxious to please, noticed a private exchange between Rosine and an unnamed investor at a charity dinner. An investor who had been rumored to lobby for a board appointment. The clip that made it to a gossip feed was short. A hand on an elbow, a whispered laugh, a tilt of the head. Not enough for an accusation, but enough for speculation. The internet did what it does, assembled rumor and hurled it like confetti. There were murmurs about Rosine being more than an accessory. There were the inevitable op-eds about values and image, and what it meant for a company to be seen with a companion who might, hypothetically, be influencing decisions. Rosine watched the chaos with a practiced indifference. She had rehearsed for this. This was, after all, the part of the job she had agreed to. Act as a public bomb, a story that made Samuel seem human in a way investors could understand. She had not counted on the relentless personal cost of being watched. Every smile was analyzed. Every whisper was a headline. Her family called, needy and grateful in the same breath. Morris made one attempt to capitalize but found to his chagrin that Rosine had sources who made inconvenient things more inconvenient for him. "Keep your head down," Samuel told her one afternoon in his office, watching the storm move across the skyline like weather sewn out of glass. There was an edge to his voice that was part instruction and part care. "Do you do that often?" she asked. "Manage reputations with the amusement of a man swinging a club?" "Often enough," he admitted. She laughed then, a short sound. "I haven't always had a manager. Mostly I've had a resume and a lot of bad luck." He looked at her as if cataloguing the details, the way a geologist studies a rock face. The rain began to smear the glass into liquid charcoal stripes. The city seemed to slow, as if the weather was clever enough to know it had to wait while these two people decided the shape of something necessary. "Tomorrow there's the Sharpboard dinner," he told her. "You will be presented as my guest. People will clap. People will gossip. Nothing else." "Definitionally, I am your guest," she said. "And I am being paid?" "Yes," he said. "I know." They were both silent for a moment, the kind that reminds the universe there is a place where people are not purely instruments. Rosine realized with a small private jolt that she did not want to be merely that to him either. There were other sorts of hunger. The night that changed everything did not begin promisingly. It started with a rumor and a rainstorm and a video someone had decided to cut into a scandal. The board dinner was glinting with silver and faces that had learned to think of everything as currency. Querita glided across the room like a rehearsed hurricane, her smile a carefully measured weapon. Morris had not given up. He had planted a whisper with a blog that ran a sly headline, "The New Girl, Purchased or Genuine?" After the dinner, when voices had become more lubricated, Rosine found herself coaxed into a brief interview on a live stream. A snappy host asked mild questions, the chat filled with speculation. Then in the middle of a throwaway comment, a man from the back of the room, some distant cousin or opportunistic connector, shouted a ridiculous insinuation. Someone filmed it. A clip landed in the worst possible place and then the worst possible time. In 30 minutes, it was everywhere. Paparazzi swarmed Samuel's building the next morning. Faintly panicked, he and Rosine exited through a private lane, umbrellas like shields against the cameras. A man shouted, "Was it for money?" as if the world had conveniently decided that her motives and her morality were the front-page entertainment it had been waiting for. Sam's car was waiting, doors whispering shut. They drove through rain-smeared streets with the soundtrack of the city like a pulsing vein. Samuel's grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled. Rosine sat beside him, the contract in her bag like a talisman. Neither spoke until they reached the penthouse that had become his refuge. The storm worsened. Lightning turned the city a bleeding blue. Thunder made the buildings shudder, as if to remind them of the smallness of their human dramas. The private elevator moved upward, and then the power flickered. The building shuddered again. A low electrical groan sounded, and then the lights went out. For a moment, the world was only silhouettes and the rain's percussion. "Generators down," Samuel said, voice low. "Security's on it." "Great," Rosine said, a humorless smile. "We have a real-life rom-com moment." He offered her whiskey, which she declined. He poured one for himself and stood by the window, watching the rain make constellations out of the city's lights. In the dark, his face seemed softer, his edges less like steel and more like something someone had carefully sanded. "This is ridiculous," he said, as if offering a commentary on fate and technology at once. "Everything I do lately is ridiculous," Rosine answered. She watched his profile in the dim, the way his jaw looked like a line drawn to keep him in check. For reasons she did not yet have language for, she wanted him to stop being a magnificent, unreachable thing for a little while. She wanted him to be a man who could be startled into being gentle. A crash echoed somewhere in the hall. Someone had dropped a tray, and they both flinched. Then there was a knock at the service door. A guard announced that the street had been blocked by downed trees, and that transfers in and out would be delayed for hours. They were, for lack of a better word, stranded. "Inconvenient," Samuel said. "So is a life without medicine," Rosine replied. He laughed softly, that same half-amused sound he made when a board member's ego needed puncturing. "I can get you home if you'd like." "No," she said. "I need to go to the hospital tonight. Zelman had a fever this morning. The medicine—" She stopped. The whole thing was fragile as glass. She wished she had not told him, but then, what was the point of a contract if not to be direct about obligations? "Then we go," he said. His voice was flat, steady, not a question. He took his keys. The hospital at night smelled worse than the one Rosine knew in the daytime. It felt thriftier, exhausted. Hallways were full of people who had nowhere else to be. The nurse at the desk recognized Rosine from her earlier visits and gave her a small private nod. Solidarity among those who live in waiting rooms. Zelman slept with an oxygen mask, and when Rosine slipped into the chair by his bed, she felt like someone who had run an urgent race. Samuel stood at the foot of the bed as if struck by the futility of so many small, fragile bodies under fluorescent lights. He had not come to be theatrical. He had come because she asked, and perhaps because he found the idea of being irrelevant to the life outside his office curious and a little offensive. Rosine did not look at him. She listened to the beeping of the monitor, the whispering of machines that were indifferent. She felt raw and exposed. "I couldn't do it any other way," she said finally, as if speaking to the machines. "I couldn't watch him get smaller." Samuel sat in the chair by her, and for the first time talked like someone who had experience with helplessness but rarely admitted it. "My sister used to burn her hands on the stove trying to cook for me because my parents were always working," he said quietly. "You think being wealthy is a shield? Sometimes it only changes what you worry about." Rosine turned to him then, surprise carving open her features. He had admitted something that made him less a creature of private vaults and more human. An admission like a small wound. "Why did you make the offer?" she asked. "Was it strategy? A charity headline? A trick?" "It was partly both," he admitted, "and maybe partly curiosity. Mostly—" he hesitated. "Mostly because I wanted someone who was not driven by family politics to be at my side. I didn't expect this." The room was dim, the machines making their private music. Samuel looked at her as if considering whether to hand her a small secret. I don't do emotions well, he added. But I do loyalty. And I would rather have someone who knows what they want than someone appointed to be a token. Rosine felt something in her chest that wasn't purely relief. It was the startling recognition that a man who rarely lost his cool had admitted a need for something honest. She had built a wall against needing anything but money. She had trained herself to be transactional because emotion was too risky. Yet in that hospital light, the wall felt porous. You're asking me to play a role, she said. You've offered money to plug a hole. You did not offer love. No, he said. I did not, and I'm not good at saying that I might want more, but I can try. For now, I can offer you protection, discretion, the money you need. I cannot promise a heart you didn't buy. I can... He stopped, frustrated by the inadequacy of corporate language in a room that required tenderness. Rosine laughed then, briefly. Protection, she echoed. I didn't realize I needed a shield and a paycheck. Yet here we are. He leaned back in his chair and watched her with an intensity she had not expected. For reasons she did not fully understand, she wanted him to see how hard her choices had been, to understand the anatomy of the bargain she had made. She wanted him to know that her acceptance was not the same as surrender. The night deepened. The storms outside made the window shimmer like broken glass. Lights in the ward blinked in their steady, indifferent manner. A doctor came by and adjusted Zellman's IV, spoke to them in quiet professional sentences, then left a silence that made them both breathe as if they'd run a long race. When Zellman's fever broke in the small hours, Rosine cried a little, her shoulders shaking like someone who had been carrying a sack for too long. Samuel sat with his hands folded in his lap, watching the contours of her face as if memorizing a map. He had never been a man to lose guard. This night he lost something else. He lost the safe notion that his emotions were merely ornaments. Later, as they left the hospital and walked through the residual rain, Rosine found herself quieter than usual. She had rehearsed lines about independence and resilience. Those lines felt inadequate in the face of raw relief. Samuel opened his car door for her with the crisp efficiency of a man who had been trained in all the small public gestures of courtesy. "Stay with me tonight," he said suddenly, the words low, "until your family is settled, until tomorrow." It was neither a demand nor a solicitation, only something that landed heavy in the night. Rosine weighed the practicalities, her mother alone at home, the small restlessness of a brother healing, and then, with a clarity that came from long practice in choice, she accepted. "One night?" she said. Not a transaction," he finished for her. He added quietly, "Consent is not a contract." They went back to his penthouse through hallways that smelled faintly of old books and citrus. The city, pillowed by rain, seemed to huddle around them. The lights were off and the generator hummed like a complacent beast. His living room was warm with lamplight, and there was immediate, ordinary humanity in the way he set a blanket over her knees when she sat on his sofa, as if caring for someone could be part of the furniture of a man. They talked at first, like people who are cataloguing their fears. Samuel asked about Zellman, about the narrow, urgent geometry of Rosine's life, and she told him with a kind of brevity that was less confession than report. He spoke of his father, and the precise arrangements that had made him a man who measured relationships in strategic advantage. He admitted quietly that there were fractures in his family he had never expected to address. When the night settled like a soft cloak, they moved closer not because the contract demanded it, but because the city had become a smaller, simpler place where two people could admit their needs. The touch that passed between them was careful and deliberate, a negotiation of consent. They did not stumble into passion. They sat on the edge of possibility and then stepped forward together. It was not cinematic in the way tabloids would later record. There were no dramatic exclamations, no theft of virtue. There was a hesitance, a clarity, a series of small mutual agreements. She kissed him because she wanted to. He held her because he chose to. They undressed vulnerability a little at a time, like someone removing a scarf sleeve and finding warmth. When they finally lay together, it felt like a human thing two people do to mark that the world is bearable for the moment. It was not a currency exchange. It was not an exploitation. It was a human honesty that had not been in the catalogue for either of them. In the morning, when Rosine woke, sunlight edged across the floor. For the first time since signing the contract, she saw Samuel as something that had changed frankly and irreversibly. He was quieter, his hands were gentle. He looked at her in a way that made the parts of her he had kept for sale feel suddenly private again. Something had altered in him too. He rose and dressed with an unfamiliar slowness, and then made coffee in a precise domestic way that seemed absurdly intimate coming from a man like him. When he handed her a cup, his gaze did not flinch. "Last night?" he said. "Wasn't?" "Business," she said, finishing his sentence. She sipped the coffee, the bitterness a small, necessary truth. "No," he said. "It wasn't. I don't know." He stopped, and then with a startling bluntness that was somehow tender, he added, "I don't do this. I don't do falling." He smiled in a crooked, self-aware way. "But I think I might have done something near it." Rosine felt something like a small bright thing rise in her chest, a dangerous hope. She did not want to be naive. She had taught herself to be careful. But she had also made a bargain with a man who had unexpectedly lost an instrument of control. His cool. They were living now in the precarious space between the contract and whatever this was. Samuel had, by his actions, moved the line from temporary to possible. He had not yet declared himself. He had, however, signaled that what had been a calculated arrangement had become complicated by feeling. The pause between them was short. Neither wanted to be hasty in public or private. But the world, inevitably, had other plans. That afternoon, the blog headlines were kinder than expected. Perhaps the storm had washed the scab of gossip off, or perhaps people were distracted with other better spectacles. Still, as Rosine tended to her brother's prescriptions and filed transfers into the account she now controlled, she felt the neatness of her plan slipping into something that demanded more courage. Would she be able to accept more than what she had negotiated without selling herself into nostalgia for a life she had never had? And then Morris did what Morris does. He reached for leverage. A video clip, a different clip than the one that had circulated earlier, surfaced on an alt site. It was short, grainy. It showed a moment from the penthouse, a shadowed sequence that, in the hands of a malicious editor, could be framed as something more salacious than it had been. The clip made little of the tenderness and more of the intimacy. It was designed to be weaponized. Rosine's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "We have the clip, $200,000 to keep it offline." She stared at the glowing black rectangle like it was a hole in the world. She felt suddenly stupid for thinking negotiation with the universe had gone according to plan. She had not sold herself into anything, she reminded herself. She had accepted a job. She had made a choice. Yet here stood the old world, ready to convert moments into merchandise. Samuel saw the message when she read it aloud at his office later that day. His jaw tightened into something that looked almost predatory. "You don't pay blackmailers," he said simply. "You have them outed. You have the blog shut down. You sue. You make an example. You let it be known that people who traffic in other people's lives will be discovered." Rosine stared at him, equal parts gratitude and fear. He had spoken as a man who had long handled threats with money and lawyers. She had no such arsenal. All she had was the contract and the warmth of a night that had somehow birthed unexpected feeling. "Do you have to handle it?" she asked. "I can—" "You're not alone in this," he said, "and don't let anyone put a price on your life." It sounded generous. It sounded like the kind of promise a man could make before he had to face family consequences. Samuel's willingness to use his influence to protect her had the beauty of a directable force. It also meant the whole spectacle had shifted from a private arrangement into something that threatened the very public world Samuel had worked to order. Morris, furious that his attempt had been forestalled, raised the stakes. The alt site re-uploaded the clip to push 3 different apps, and then a new rumor about an arrangement popped up with suspicious efficiency. Quirita's camp saw opportunity and began whispering to the right people about Samuel's distractions. Sir Xavier, precise and alarmed, asked Samuel to close ranks. Sam's response was not avoidance. He summoned his inner circle and announced bluntly that anyone engaged in blackmail or manipulation would be dealt with. He requested surveillance audits of known agitators. He ordered the legal team to proceed. He did not expect warm gratitude. He did expect the machinery of consequence to do its work. Meanwhile, Rosine's mother called daily with a voice that shifted between proud and terrified. Zelman slowly regained color, and at night, when Rosine sat by his bed, she felt the contract in her pocket like a small foreign thing. She had bought time. She had also made a person into a stakeholder in a life she had not intended to share. Human feelings are slippery like that. For the first time since she had signed, Rosine worried less about money and more about the shape of her future. The contract had given her the power to keep a life intact. It had also brought with it the potential to lose the core of what made her herself. Samuel, in his way, was transforming too. Something in him had been shifted by intimacy that was not commanded, and now his choices had opened new, dangerous territories. He had intervened on her behalf, and by doing so, he had created a public alliance as much as a private one. That night, they sat across from one another in Samuel's study, two people measured by deeds and debts. They were quiet because the world outside had not yet learned to be gentle. Between them lay the contract, now an odd relic since it had already begun to mean more than money. "I should have known better than to make a moral calculation out of a human need," Rosine said, half to herself. "I wanted to keep what we have, money, safety, distinct, but people blur lines." Samuel looked at her, and the light in his eyes was neither calculating nor cold. It was simple and dangerous. It was the look someone gives when they have decided to risk something in order to keep another person safe. "We will handle Morris," he said. "We will handle the blogs. We will do it carefully, and I will—" He paused, finding a phrase. Finding a phrase that wasn't a ledger entry or a shareholder memo. "I will stand with you," he said finally, "not because I bought you, but because I choose to." The words landed in the small study like a verdict. Rosine's laugh was a sharp, incredulous sound at first, the sound of someone who had rehearsed cynicism for a living. Then she looked at him the way she would study a new map, searching for the routes that might lead somewhere safe. "That sounds admirable," she said. "It also sounds expensive." "It will cost you nothing," he answered, and that was not entirely true. It would cost him reputation, leverage, the tidy certainties he'd built around loyalty and strategy. He would pay, in ways that were not merely financial, for siding with what he had not planned to love. They set a plan in motion that night. Samuel's legal team, which moved like a second nervous system, began by tracing the clip's origins. Forensics combed servers and shadow pages. Lawyers issued cease and desist orders. PR architects drafted a narrative that would both protect the company and cut the oxygen to the rumor mills. Samuel insisted the approach be surgical. He would not only quash the immediate threat, he wanted the people behind it exposed. Rosine, for her part, was not content to be defended. The phone that had tried to extort her was not the beginning of the problem, it was a symptom. Whoever had a taste for manipulating images had networks, and networks had veins. She spent the next week meeting with people she had learned to know in lives before immaculate suits and penthouse views. A web administrator who owed her a favor, a freelance journalist who liked being paid fairly for stories, a private investigator who had once helped a cousin disappear from a dangerous ex. She was pragmatic, efficient, a woman arranging resources the way other people arrange groceries. Her decisions were never pretty, they were effective. "It feels strange using information like a scalpel," she told Samuel once, when they had a quiet moment between legal calls, "but I learned that sometimes you have to cut out the tumor before it kills you." He watched her, and he watched the world she moved in, her quick alliances, her way of turning leverage into safety. He liked the way she never pretended her hands were clean when they needed to work. She had a kind of moral realism he admired. It made him uncomfortable and, paradoxically, more protective. He was learning that to protect someone did not always mean to sanitize them. Morris, realizing his first extortion attempt had been neutralized, escalated. He was not a man who took failure lightly. In his mind, a woman who had the temerity to refuse payment for blackmail was a challenge to be answered. He reached out to Querita Baird, who had already felt the stakes of Rosine's presence at the gala. Querita wanted Samuel's alliance to tilt toward her planned match, toward a lineage sown with predictable marriages and familiar faces. Morris offered Querita a petty promise. If she helped discredit Rosine, his connections would grease some wheels for Querita's supporters. She, hungry for confirmation and wounded pride, agreed. They devised a new plan that was meaner, more public, A staged confrontation at a family banquet, filmed by a plant in the crowd, that would portray Rosine as manipulative and possibly bought. The objective was simple: make Rosine look like merchandise and Samuel look compromised. So Xavier, who already viewed Rosine as an inconvenient variable, quietly breathed into this plan with the same faint approval one offers to a surgical schedule. He did not need to know the details. The suggestion that Rosine might be undermining the family's legacy was enough. Rosine knew the banquet would be a theater. She also knew that while appearances could be performed, damage left in their wake could be scarred for years. She spent the days before preparing not just her smile, but her countermeasures. She met with the security team Samuel authorized and insisted on a sweep of the guest list. She asked for plainclothes checks and demanded access to list logs. She scoured layout plans to find the camera blind spots. They were always somewhere, in corners, behind oxidized chandeliers. She refused to be surprised. On the night of the banquet, the ballroom was a polychrome of silk and expectation. Sir Xavier, arrayed in a jacket that seemed to hold decades of decisions, watched the room like a conductor waiting for his chorus. Quirita moved with pale confidence, her smile polished into a blade. People leaned toward one another with the small hunger that can only come from eavesdropping on wealth. Rosine stepped into the light as who she was supposed to be. Companion, accessory, the object of curiosity. The trap, when it came, arrived like a shallow, predictable wave. A planted guest spilled grape juice and, apologizing with a rehearsed clumsiness, brushed Rosine's sleeve. The cameraman at the bar, a man planted by Morris, tilted his lens. A whisper traveled through the lilies and candles. It was everything the conspirators had hoped for. An image of Rosine flustered, touched, and vulnerable. But Rosine had anticipated this. Her hand was steady. She took a breath, smiled, and transformed the moment into theater. She made of the spill a joke, a small anecdote about the inconvenience of being living art. The cameras leaned forward for an angle. She offered them nothing they could chew on beyond a poised retort. The attempt to shape a slanderous clip into something damaging failed at the moment it was supposed to succeed, because she refused to be small. Morris, frustrated, moved to an uglier tactic. He bought the loyalty of a low-level fixer, someone who could move bodies without thinking about faces. For Morris, leverage was always most effective when it cut to what people loved most. He had watched Rosine's careful finances from a distance and deduced where she had invested the money Samuel had given her. Zellman's care, rent, deferred repairs on a house that smelled like rosemary and old prayers. If he could hurt her there, he could break her. The fixer tried to abduct Zellman from his narrow apartment, believing he could ransom the brother back, demand more money, and force Rosine into capitulation. The night the abduction was attempted, Rosine had fallen asleep on the couch after a long day of hospital visits. She woke to the clatter of keys and a soft voice in the hallway. Her mother, usually so anxious, was facing a dark doorway with nothing but a dish towel in her hand. In the corridor, a man moved with a small, practiced silence. Adrenaline sharpened Rosine into something that had nothing to do with contracts. She sprang from the couch and met the man before he could reach the bedroom. The hallway was a narrow place where physical strength mattered less than speed, and Rosine's speed was a thing she'd cultivated out of necessity. She grabbed the man's wrist, heard the small pop of knuckles, and in the scuffle managed to pull him into the light. He was ashamedly small, pale under the overhead lamp. Her mother screamed, then momentarily recovered into the protective clatter of someone who would never be docile. The man, rattled, ran. He left footprints in the sheet of rainwater that had tracked into the building like a trail to his retreat. Zellman, woken by the noise, called for Rosine in a voice that was both delirious and forgiving. She knelt beside him and wept for the first time in a long while. The tears were not only for the danger that had passed, but for the realization that her life had become a target. When she told Samuel, he moved with the calm ferocity of a man who had a private army of lawyers and security officers he had paid to be ready. He pressed charges, found the fixer through his own channels, and arranged surveillance that tracked the path back to Morris. He did not go straight to the press. He didn't need to perform a public spectacle to show power. Instead, he let the legal system do what it does when someone with resources chooses to use it. The fixer was found, detained, and in his interrogations the thin pipes of Morris's network were revealed. Morris, anticipating the net, panicked. He tried to leverage what little he had left: anonymous posts, a fake dossier about Rosine's past, a claim that Samuel's generosity masked a dark bargain. His last attempt was to unmask Rosine in a press conference to produce supposedly incontrovertible proof that she had been paid more than the contract and had accepted other favors. But the paperwork Samuel's team presented was airtight. Bank transfers traceable to the agreed account in Rosine's name, correspondence, legal affidavits that undermined Morris's credibility. The confrontation ended with Morris sitting in a police station, disgusted and furious, while his co-conspirators scuttled away like insects from the light. The fallout was not instantaneous social annihilation for the villains. Life is rarely that clean, but it was effective. Morris's reputation was shredded. He faced charges for attempted extortion and conspiracy, and the prosecutors, banking their own cross-questions, pressed hard. Querita, who had briefly enjoyed the thrill of being the woman who might displace Rosine, suddenly found supporters uncertain. A hidden email chain surfaced, showing Querita congratulating Morris privately for his resourcefulness. The public's appetite for scandal turned on curiosity and maybe a touch of sympathy for Rosine, who had a story that read as both brave and tragic. Querita's bright future dimmed when her inner circle betrayed her to save their own standings. Sir Xavier, for his part, did not fare as well. His attempts to manage the narrative, to instruct his son in how to control what was considered family, exposed a rot of old arrangements, backhanded deals, offshore investments meant to secure tradition at the expense of transparency. Samuel, who had learned not to be merely a creature of his father's design, used evidence gathered during the scandals to negotiate terms. He did not humiliate his grandfather out of cruelty. He did so to preserve the company from a legacy of secretive deals that could destroy everyone. Sir Xavier was forced into a kind of restrained retirement, publicly dignified, privately furious. His power was softened, not destroyed. Samuel believed in consequences, not annihilation. Through all of this, the contract that had begun as a ledger entry started to feel like the least important document in the room. It had earned its keep by buying Zelman's medicine and by making it possible for Rosine to sleep at night. But the risk it carried, turning someone into a commodity, had been shown for what it could be. Rosine's insistence that the funds be under her control had been crucial. It had kept her from being financially trapped. The company's board, which had watched the spectacle and feared shareholder panic, now watched Samuel choose values over caution. It made them uneasy in the short term, and eventually more respectful. There were small, tender scenes threaded through the legal and public maneuvers that mattered far more than any victory in a courtroom. Samuel began to be someone who arrived at the hospital before Rosine did, sitting in the small chairs not as a symbol but as a companion. He learned how to make coffee in the break room without being conspicuous. He argued with nurses over the best way to manage Zelman's post-operative care, and in the way he listened to the doctor, Rosine saw the parts of him that his boardroom presence had hidden, an earnestness she had not expected, a brittle humility that made him human. One evening, in a private moment after a successful deposition that had pinned Morris to a string of corrupt actions, Samuel took Rosine to the roof of his building. The city was spilled out below, lights like the scatter of small promises. He did not have a speech prepared. He did not try to sell love or produce an orchestrated confession. He offered a quiet account of what he had learned, about the cost of shielding oneself from risk, and about the unexpected value of someone who refuses to be swallowed by pity. "I promised I would stand with you," he said. "I meant it in the law and in the ledger, but I think I meant it in something else as well." Rosine, who had learned the language of bargains and what they bought, recognized the tremor in his voice as something like fear. Fear is an honest animal. He let it out. "I can't promise I won't hurt you," he added quickly, peculiarly vulnerable. "I don't know the shape of everything I might wreck, but I want you to know that what I feel isn't a commodity. It isn't a box I can file away." Rosine studied him, cataloging the newness. There had been so many men who saw her need and felt only transactional satisfaction. Samuel did not do that. He had crossed the boundary between protector and partner in small, quiet ways, staying up at the hospital, pushing back at his own family, using his resources to prosecute a man who had meant to intimidate her. Those were not gestures a man makes when he thinks of someone as property. "You could have walked away," she said. "You chose not to." He nodded. "I chose something stupid and expensive. I chose to care." The roof was cold. Their breath made small smoky ghosts between them. When he reached for her, it was not to buy anything. It was to see if what had been bought could be returned as choice. She found her hand in his and squeezed, the pressure a shorthand contract of its own. They kissed, a careful thing, and in the way they kept touching, in the way their mouths closed around each other's names, there was the quiet proof that a contract had been eclipsed by a choice freely made. But the world beyond their breath continued to spin. There were board meetings to survive, lawyers to placate, a family to navigate. The final confrontation arrived in a form less dramatic than tabloids would prefer, but more lethal in consequence. A shareholder vote on a revision of the company's governance that would have given Sir Xavier and the old guard more unilateral control. It was a quiet coup, meant to re-establish the kind of steady, predictable lineage that does not tolerate the unpredictable human heart. Quirita, playing an old-fashioned game of alliance, had garnered some backers. If the vote passed, Samuel's will to keep Rosine safe would be hamstrung by rules and precedent. Samuel called a press conference that would not be a press release. He stood in front of the board, rid of the private language he usually used for counsel. He spoke not as a man defending his taste, but as a man declaring his intention. He refused, publicly, to be ashamed of what he had done. He told shareholders, plainly, and with an unexpected tenderness, that Rosine's presence in his life had been his choice and his responsibility. He presented to them the truth of his family's past misdealings and the legal steps already taken to unwind them. He produced evidence of Morris's attempted extortion, Quirita's collusion, and Sir Xavier's undisclosed arrangements. People in the room listened with the stunned silence of people realizing they had been given a different story than the one they'd been paid to swallow. Some were angry that he had dragged private difficulties into the shareholder report. Others admired the rawness of his candor. The result of the vote was not total victory. It was not written in marble, but a majority of shareholders sided with him, tired of sleeping on the foundations of decaying deals. They chose accountability. It was the kind of outcome that didn't feel like a triumph, because it cost him a severing of old ways, but it also meant Rosine and Samuel could move forward without the board's shadowed strings tightening around their necks. Exposed and defeated, Morris faced legal consequences. Quirita's social prospects dimmed. She was forced into an apology tour that felt both hollow and necessary. Sir Xavier retreated into a dignified silence, his dominance curtailed by both his grandson's blunt choices and the board's desire for survival over tradition. The consequences for each villain were neither a purgative moral lesson delivered with relish nor a humiliation performed for a crowd. They were consequences that left room for regret where regret could exist and punishment where laws demanded it. In the quieter aftermath, with the worst of the public storms abated, Rosine found a strange calm. Zelman recovered slowly, a crawl back toward color and sound that could be measured in small victories, an able hand on a guitar that resumed a tentative tune, jokes that were once hushed tripling in volume. Rosine's parents, chastened by the terror of a near abduction, grew less demanding. They appreciated money not for its sheen but for its utility. The house that smelled of rosemary still needed work. Rosine used the funds she managed to fix the roof and arrange realistic payments for care that would not leave them precarious again. She felt, for the first time in years, that she was building something sustainable rather than merely patching leaks. Samuel, for his part, learned how to be a partner when that meant more than gestures. He asked small, genuine questions about her plans. He sat through a therapy appointment with Zelman, not to be photographed, but because he wanted to see what it looked like when people healed. He answered her practical questions about investments and joint liability and listened, which to Rosine sounded like commitment. "Marriage is one of those legal instruments," she said once, half joking, in a candlelit kitchen where they were attempting to make pasta without setting off the smoke alarm. He looked at her, half amused and fully earnest. "It is," he agreed. "So is a partnership agreement. I would be happy to present you with either, but I want you to know that whatever paper we sign, my decision is not a financial calculation." "Then make it clear," she said. Make it something that says I'm not bought. Make it a choice, one that you had to make, not one you were pushed into. He reached for the pad of paper he kept for note-taking, always practical, and wrote in an almost grotesquely deliberate scrawl, "Choice acknowledged, partnership is equal." He handed it to her. She laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that means permission and curiosity. Their life settled into a routine that was less dramatic but more human. They went to board meetings, and then to hospital corridors. They bickered about tenants in her building, and debated the right dosage of candor to use in confronting Sir Xavier. They shared quiet breakfasts on Sundays, the contract folded into a drawer that neither of them opened. The paper was the beginning of something, but no longer the end. One evening, months after the storm that had tried to make Rosine into an object, Samuel invited her to the same rooftop where they'd stood the night he first admitted the risk of caring. The city had fewer storms then. The lights were steady, as if someone had decided to finally keep the bulbs lit. He did not bring lawyers or a prepared speech. He had instead something simple, a small velvet box that was hardly appropriate for a man who usually spoke in dividends and holdings. He took both her hands, and his eyes were all blunt honesty. "When I offered you a contract, it was simple. It was a business arrangement with goals and timelines. What I did not expect was how hollow that would feel if I didn't choose you beyond the terms. I don't know what I will be like when life demands more of us, maybe clumsy, maybe stubborn. But I do know this. I choose you, freely, not because I can buy you but because I want you beside me." Rosine's throat was thick. She had played this negotiation for so long, money for safety, calculation for survival, that being asked to accept something offered as a choice felt almost indecent. She had spent years defending against being purchased. Now she was being asked to accept love that could have no inference of purchase. "Then say it in a way that protects me," she said. "Not because I mistrust you, but because I know the world will keep trying to classify me. I don't want people to say she was bought. I want them to know I chose this." Samuel smiled in a way that was softer than any boardroom smirk. He slid the box open. Inside was not an extravagance, it was a ring simple enough to be unspectacular and therefore honest. "I cannot buy your choice," he said, "but I can promise to honor it. I will sign partnership papers with you that declare equal standing. I will do everything in my power to make sure you are never put into a position where you can be coerced. Will you marry me? Will you be my partner in the company of life?" She let the question sit. The city below hummed with 1,000 small lives. Rosine thought of Zelman playing his guitar again, of her mother sleeping easier, of the contract in the drawer that had once been a lifeline. She thought of the nights of practical decision-making and the nights of quiet tenderness that had revealed to her that the man beside her could be chosen, not purchased. "Yes," she said finally, and it was not a surrender, but a negotiated agreement between two adults who knew costs and wanted to share them. "Yes, with conditions." "Name them," he said, smiling. "Equal partnership, full control over my funds if I choose to keep them separate, and no annulling of my autonomy under any circumstances," she listed, words measured like clauses. "Done," he said. He kissed her, briefly, and then more longingly, because sometimes a contract is best consummated in a kiss that confirms it. It was not the beginning of a fairy tale that erased all pain. It was the beginning of a life that acknowledged scars and chose to move forward with them. They negotiated a public statement that was as much about truth as it was about privacy. Samuel stood beside Rosine when he read it, and when the cameras asked if she had been bought, she answered with a voice that was simultaneously weary and fierce. "I entered into a contract to save a life," she said. "It worked, but I was never for sale. I entered because I chose to. I will continue to choose." The words reframed the narrative. No longer was she an object in a story written by men who assumed to buy allegiance. She was a person who had used what she had to protect the ones she loved, and in the process had been offered something she had every right to refuse or accept. Justice, when it came, arrived in practical bureaucratic forms. Morris pleaded guilty to a series of charges. Quirita's supporters abandoned her slowly. Sir Xavier retired to a quiet estate with the dignity of a man who had lost influence but not life. None of them disappeared from the pages of society. Scandal is a long tale, but they were not able to rewrite the story entirely. Rosine and Samuel rebuilt around that scar. They married in a small ceremony, the guest list intimate enough to hold only family and a few allies who had stuck by them through trials. Zelman played a clumsy but enthusiastic version of a song he'd once left half-finished. His laughter filled corners that had been hollow a year before. Rosine's mother cried and then laughed in the same breath. Parents mended their ways in the small, convincing acts that mattered, stepping in to cook or sit with the patient, accepting help instead of demanding it. After the vows, after the legal instruments had been drafted in ways that protected Rosine's autonomy, the partnership agreement that guaranteed equal standing signed in ink that meant nothing to the heart but everything to the law, Samuel stopped pretending that his life was tidy. "We will have bad days," he admitted, in a moment of surprising candor while they walked through their garden. "We will have fights that sound like lawsuits, but I promise to always try to choose you." Rosine leaned into him. She could feel, beneath the warmth of his arm, the old invoices and the new life both holding steady. She had not sold herself. She had made a deal to save a life and then chosen something else when it was offered on honest terms. She had been pragmatic until the point where pragmatism met tenderness, and then she had allowed tenderness to exist on its own terms. There were no miracles in the sense of a world fixed. There were also no disasters. The enemies that had tried to use her as a narrative device were dealt with legally and publicly. The family that had once pressured her learned to respect boundaries, if only through the stern tutelage of consequence. Zelman recovered into a life that was not perfect, but was his, with Rosine by his side more often than not. Samuel's company thrived because accountability became a pillar of its identity. Their marriage was not a gilded cage, but a negotiated partnership that kept each of them free. On the night they removed the contract from its drawer and burned it, literally as a private ceremony of closure, Rosine felt an odd lightness. She watched the paper curl and blacken, and then fall into ash. The act was symbolic but true. The contract had served its purpose, but it did not have to define the rest of her life. Samuel stood beside her with his hand in hers, a steady, adult grip. "You were always more than a clause," he said. "So were you," she replied. "Less a ledger and more a person." Hard to believe. They laughed then, and it was the small, concordant sound of people who had survived public scrutiny, private fear, and legal battles to arrive at a place where choice mattered more than transaction. Years later, when people asked how they had done it, made a mercantile beginning bloom into something real, Rosine would say that the contract had done what contracts can do. It had bought time. What happened after that was not purchased. It was nurtured, risked, and above all, chosen. Samuel had fallen after one night that refused to be only about commerce. He had fallen hard not because of money, but because he had discovered in her something he had not intended to, someone who would stand with him when things were hard, someone whose moral realism and stubborn kindness could not be folded into a ledger. They built a life in which love was not a balance sheet line and protection was not ownership. She kept control of the money she had earned. He humbled himself to the idea that wealth can allow for choice but cannot force it. They negotiated, as partners do, the terms that made them feel safe and free. They faced the world together and, when necessary, fought its worst machinations. In the end, the story that began with a signed contract and a hospital bill ended with a single quiet truth. Not everything that starts as business must remain so. Sometimes the most costly bargains give way to something no amount of money could buy. An equal partnership chosen in the open and kept by consent. If you love this twisty emotional ride and want more stories about bargains that turn into something deeper, subscribe and watch the next chapter in our series.